As it is the top of the hour, I just want to kick things off and introduce today's class. This is the first session of Lessons and Legacies in Masechet Avot with Rabbi Yonatan Kohn. This is one of Drisha's Sfira Zman offerings. This class is a part of our Rivka Rosenwein Mishnah division, sponsored by her family in her memory. In this course, we will explore subtle linguistic and editorial elements of Masechet Avot to get a glimpse of the world of the sages, how they studied, taught, and acted as custodians of the tradition. Do a careful study of lesser-known teachings from Avot in light of competing textual traditions, particularly those of Avot de Rabbi Natan and the other, quote, minor tractates and medieval commentaries. We will uncover an Avot as intellectually profound as it is spiritual. Special attention will be paid to the 15th century commentary of the Rashbatz. For those who haven't had the pleasure of learning with him, Rabbi Yonatan Kohn is a doctoral student in the history department of the Jewish people at Ben Gurion University. His dissertation explores the writing of of the Rashbatz. He received smicha at Yeshiva University's Gross Institute and is a teacher at several schools in yeshivot in the U.S. and Israel. He has also contributed to the Kohn Stencils Project, the Tzurba Mirabanan series, and other publications. He is teaching to us today from Yad Binyamin in Israel. And to thank you to everyone who is stepping in. As people join in, I'm going to go post comments in chat, and I'm going to send invitations to panelists. If you are in a place where you can do it, I really recommend you can. You can turn on your camera, you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. I will also be monitoring the chats on both Zoom and Facebook Live for questions. We do want to hear your opinions, and I will bring them to Rabbi Kohn's attention as he makes space for questions. And with that, I want to hand things over to him.
Okay, great. Thank you. How many people do we have with us at this point? Is it anybody know?
Right now we have about 3 on Zoom, and I cannot check on Facebook.
Okay, terrific. All right. Can I trouble you to put the text? I'll let you know. And
okay, you're gonna have to. Yeah, you're gonna have to let me know when you want me to put text on.
Okay, terrific. Okay, thank you.
But I'm going to post them in chat right now.
Okay. So let's just get started. Good morning or good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to have the chance to teach on Zoom. It's almost as good as in person. Of course, teaching is a central theme in what we'll be studying, and I hope that will all come across. But we'll get more to that in just a moment. Okay, so just a few questions are in order, a few clarifications really are in order before we jump right into the text. Of course, hard to know exactly how many people clicked and registered because they felt some personal obligation or they know me, and how many people were drawn by the topic. But I would say that I wanted to teach this, and I'm very grateful that my friend Rabbi John Kelson, invited me to participate here because he knows that I'm crazy about Masechet Avot. That's really also how I got involved with Rashbatz, who's the subject of my doctorate. Masechet Avot is probably, without any contest, the most famous and well-known of the tractates of the Mishnah, and perhaps, I would say really probably the most famous and well-known of all of rabbinic literature. I say rabbinic literature, I'm talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh that was ultimately canonized in a written form. It's the oral tradition, but canonized in a written form, really beginning with the Mishnah, the end of the 2nd century, the Common Era, and through the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud Bavli, the Gemaras, and including all the Midrashim and many other more minor works. So Masechet Avot is near and dear to many people's hearts. I would just like to point out as a really funny kind of anecdote. I was walking around. On the campus of the University of Pennsylvania back when it was safe to do so, which is really, not so long ago. But But I was walking around there a few years ago, and I noticed an enormous number of, maybe enormous is an exaggeration, but many quotes from Benjamin Franklin, because the university is completely obsessed with him, etched into the ground, etched into the sidewalk as you're walking around on campus. And I thought that was kind of cool. It's supposed to be kind of cool for if you're nerdy a little bit, and it was a little bit cool for a nerd. But not just that it was cool. All of a sudden, I realized, hey, wait a second, that's a Mishnah in Masechet Avot, and that's a Mishnah in Masechet Avot. Franklin was excellent at putting things into nice and easy, edible English for his intellectual or somewhat intellectual audience in the colonies in the 18th century, but a lot of it was learned from other places. And I don't know that it was the standards. You have to ask an intellectual historian, which I'm not. But yeah, I don't know if the standards of that time would have called it plagiarism, but many of the brilliant things that he learned directly or indirectly from the Jewish tradition, specifically from Masechet Avot. So Masechet Avot is for sure not only famous and beloved by the Jews, but for those who know, famous and beloved also to the intellectual non-Jews who have some interest in what the Jewish tradition has to teach. Now, before we go any further, really, we need to ask ourselves, if we haven't yet, what is this Masechet about? And I'd say more concretely, what is it supposed to be about? I say that because when you're mentioning Masechet Avot to certain people, they might know it better by its English name, which is
Ethics of the Fathers.
Thank you. Ethics of the Fathers, according to many, Ethics of the Fathers, or Teachings of the Fathers, or Chapters of the Fathers, right? Depending on which publication you have, but that's, I would say, the dominant sense is that the word Avot means fathers. And in fact, there are many commentaries over the centuries who point to the fact that Masechet Avot, more than any other Masechet, brings to life or emphasizes the personal details, really not so much actually, but a little bit, at least the names of the authors of the specific statements, and we'll come back to that as well. And so therefore, Avot, the fathers, refers to the teachers. The teachers in the Masechet, we refer to them as our fathers. This is an old rabbinic motif that it has a few expressions in different places, but according to the Chachamim, it's the proper interpretation even of the verse that we say in Shema, V'shinan tam levanecha. Say it every day. You shall sharpen it or review it to your sons. And sons, the rabbis explained, is not limited to your biological progeny, but really anyone you teach is also your son. And the sages went a little further. They said, just as a father brings a child into this world, a biological father, so too a teacher brings his student into the world to come. And that's the basis for this idea that we would refer to the authors of the Mishnah as the Avot. And therefore, their teachings are the teachings of the Avot. One little problem with that, of course, which is we don't normally refer to the authors of the Mishnah specifically as the Avot. We talk about the Avot, the fathers in Judaism. Patriarchs are biblical. Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and we have Imahot also. Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. But the authors of the Mishnah are not normally referred to as Avot. There are a couple allusions to this, and like I said, it stands on good footing. There are many authorities who saw it that way. I mentioned that the individuals who speak in Masechet Avot get extra attention. The truth is there are some speakers in Masechet Avot whose names are not really known to us from almost any other sources. There are few mentions or sole mentions in all of the Mishnah, and then all of the Talmud is in Masechet Avot. So that is striking and noteworthy. It's almost like this is their only chance to speak. But in general, when you learn Mishnah, you're learning things that the Chachamim wanted you to know, things that were part of the oral tradition. And most of it is done, again, throughout all of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which again, written in the beginning of the 3rd century. Most of it is done completely anonymously. This is the law of the Sukkah, and this is the law of the Lulav, and this is the law of the Shofar. Occasionally, uh, it's not so rare, but it's the exception to the rule. Occasionally, we have a debate. So most of the statements are anonymous, and then sometimes you have a certain rabbi's name attached to a position because he goes against the other rabbis. So Rabbi Yehuda says this, and Rabbi Yossi says this. And then again, it's not like there's a very short list, but it's not all of the Tanaim. We have certain names that we know come up as combatants or authorities of certain positions. But in Masechet Avot, in the first 2 chapters, really the first 4 chapters, a name is attached to basically every statement. And this begs the question, why is this particular teaching, why do we need to know that this particular teaching is associated with a particular person? I will just give a little shout out to a really creative and very insightful series of books written by Rabbi Binyamin Lau, Rabbi Dr. Binyamin Lau. It was originally, I think, a series of lectures that he gave in Hebrew in his synagogue in Yerushalayim, and it's been translated into English also. And Hebrew it's called, I believe, Chachamim, and in English it's called The Sages. So that's a good translation. And it emphasizes the historical background to all of Masechet Avot. It's not purely biographical. There's a lot of biography, but I would say more historical. What was going on in the Jewish world at the time, and how we can appreciate the teachings of the different Mishnayot in light of that historical background, political drama, Rabbi Lau. The Jewish people. Okay, I think, however, we need to explore another possible definition, which to me is actually more compelling, an identification for what Masechet Avot is supposed to be about. You'll please excuse me. Yad Binyamin is right near an airbase, and occasionally we hear airplanes overhead, so I might pause if it gets really, really loud. Avot is a word that is used in many different places in the Mishnah, specifically, to refer to, we know it perhaps most famously from the laws of Shabbat. The word avot is always paired with toladot. And in that context, the word avot means, it's a little bit hard to put a finger on.
Major sources or headlines.
Okay, I like all those words. Major is a great word, though you were using to modify something, but major, right? Sources, headlines, archetypes, and a tolada is a derivative. And we have that in terms of Hilchot Shabbat. There are 39 primary or archetype labors of which are forbidden on Shabbat, and from those we have many extended prohibitions, some of which developed over time through technology, right? Something which is a derivative of an action which was done in the old world. We have also avot of tum'ah and avot of nizikin, of damages. So avot, if it's just avot and not avot of something, avot, right? Another, you're not belonging to Shabbat or a specific category. The avot are the archetypes, the major principles. And in fact, the way that Benjamin Franklin probably fell in love with Masechet Avot is that Avot is brilliantly global and general and relevant all at the same time. In other words, everything that's said in Masechet Avot at a certain point, Masechet Avot is so quotable because you immediately can identify in many of the statements. We should probably do a little more work to make it all of the statements. But in many of the statements, right away, we can see this is a principle for life. So Masechet Avot is the Masechet of principles. This is not my own, I'd like to think that I'd like to take credit for it. But there were Rishonim who identified this name of Masechet Avot as referring to that specifically as well, or perhaps primarily rather than the tractate of the fathers. They're all the tractate of the fathers, said all of them. If you say the Tanaim or the fathers, but really that this Mishnah more than any other gives us these archetypes, these major principles, which inform so many other things in life. I want to take that a little bit further as we'll read the first Mishnah in just a moment, but two more general introductory points before we get far into it. One, of course, is why are we doing Masechet Avot now? I really would say, do Masechet Avot every day of the year. You want to do it properly. Every Mishnah should take at least an hour. There's more than 100 Mishnayot and Avot, so it should take 100 hours, 100 days. So we're going to do the gross injustice of doing a little survey in 5 hours. But this particular period of Sfirat HaOmer is deeply connected to Masechet Avot in our liturgical culture for more than 1,000 years. It's already mentioned by the Geonim, the major rabbinic leaders in Babylonia after the sealing of the Talmud, from approximately the 8th century to the 11th century. The Geonim already wrote, we have a custom to recite Masechet Avot, this tractate, once a week on Shabbat in the summertime, and specifically in the period of Sfirat HaOmer between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, after Pesach ends, Pesach takes the first week of Sfirat HaOmer. After Pesach ends, we have 6 more weeks of Sfirat HaOmer, but whoops, there are only 5 chapters of Masechet Avot, so what are we going to do on the 6th week? Sit around and twiddle our thumbs? Of course not. So the Chachamim found another chapter, which is actually not originally in the Mishnah of Masechet Avot, and we are not going to give it its due in this course. We have 5 weeks and five lessons, but they appended a 6th chapter, and that's actually a professor, Nachem Milan, who argues that this is the origin of the name Pirkei Avot, right? Chapters of Avot, not just Masechet Avot, because the 6th chapter is not really part of the Masechet, but it's a chapter that was associated with Avot. And that chapter deals specifically with things related to receiving the Torah. And in fact, if you study that chapter, you'll see the literary style of the chapter is different. The content is different. And it's not the pure original Masechet Avot, not to take anything away from the 6th chapter, but maybe to trump up the first 5. So Masechet Avot is traditional. For more than 1,000 years, it's been a tradition to read Masechet Avot during this period of Pesach to Shavuot, and that also is a kind of a preparation that was seen and liturgically as a preparation for the coming receiving of the Torah that we have at the end of Sfirat HaOmer. And one more introductory note. Sorry, we'll make it one with two little notes. In my introduction, in my synopsis, I guess, of the course, I highlighted 2 external sources. One is Avot Rabbi Natan. If you've never learned Avot Rabbi Natan, you are missing something wild. If you like Pirkei Avot, then you'll love Avot Rabbi Natan. Avot Rabbi Natan is an old text. Also, its origin is not entirely clear. It's printed with what's called the minor tractates and the Gemaras and the Shas, the Vilna Shas, but it's not actually originally one of the minor tractates. We'll talk about the minor tractates another time. It's older. It has origins perhaps even in the 3rd century. It's called the Avot of Rabbi Natan. In other words, it is a competing tradition, basically, for what Masechet Avot is supposed to be. But it's not the Avot of the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. It's the Avot of another authority named Rabbi Natan. It might be the Tana Rabbi Natan, not entirely clear. And it comes either from around the time of the Mishnah, from the 3rd century, or perhaps later, as late as perhaps the 8th or 9th century. But it's certainly very, very old, and many of the Rishonim availed themselves of Avot Rabbi Natan. Now, I mentioned that Masechet Avot has 5 chapters. Avot Rabbi Natan has many, many more, and they're longer in many ways. And significantly, Avot Rabbi Natan comes down to us in 2 versions, 2 sometimes very, very distinct textual versions. Avot Rabbi Natan Aleph, what an exciting name, and Avot Rabbi Natan Bet, version 1 and version 2. The version 1 is the more well-known one. It's published in, like I said, in the Vilna Shas. But version 2, we know, was in front of some of the Rishonim, the medieval authorities, including Rashbatz, Rabbi Shimon ben Zemach Duran. That's a name that I hope we'll mention a lot here. If you have not heard of Rashbatz, you're in great company. Many, many people have not. You say put any four letters together beginning with the Resh, and you'll probably come up with the name of a Rishon. Okay, but no, I didn't pull this out of a hat. Rashbatz is Rabbi Shimon ben Zemach, and in his time he was greatly known and renowned as a front row authority on really everything and anything Jewish. He was born in Mallorca in 1361 to a wealthy and very, very well-read family. He was educated in many disciplines and became a physician. And he was a happy, practicing, brilliant physician in his youth until the year 1391. And again, like most, if you're like most people, the number 1391 that year doesn't necessarily jump out in your head. But if I tell you Spanish history and you're going to poke at a year, you'll probably say 1492. So far less known is that 100 years before that, in 1391, that's really when the Judaism in Spain began to collapse in earnest. I'm taking massive history books and debates and compressing them into literally a 90-second summary. But 1391, unfortunately, was a summer of riots in which a third of the Jewish population in Spain basically was either killed or had to flee for their lives, and another third of the Jewish population was converted to Christianity, and that is really the beginning of the massive converso phenomenon. So Rashbatz was one of the fortunate ones to escape with his life, and there's no reason to think that he was converted to Christianity, but he escaped with his life from Mallorca and ended up as a refugee in North Africa, in Algiers. And at the age of 30, as a refugee, with other refugees, thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of other Jewish refugees to North Africa, he writes that he had to abandon his practice of medicine, and ultimately, over the next 10 years, shifted into a position of being one of the great rabbinic leaders of this community, a refugee community, a rebuilding community that had to leave at the drop of a hat without their material means, and whose wider familial lives were completely shattered by the new phenomenon of massive conversions to Christianity among siblings or spouses or cousins. So we're talking about a time of exceptional crisis. And Rashbatz, at this young age of 30, against the background of his broad education, begins to write many Sfarim. One of the Sfarim that he writes is a commentary on Masechet Avot, and we will refer to that commentary. And hopefully, at least we'll have a couple of occasions, hopefully, to shed some historical light on his comments. Okay, now it's 4:24, so I think, or 9:24, so I think it's time to start. Kayla, if you would mind, please sharing the source on the screen.
Yep, one moment while I get that up. Can everyone see it?
Yep.
All right, good.
Terrific. Okay, so let's start at the top. Kayla, please let me know if there are any questions that pop up, anything pressing. Okay,
Absolutely.
let's start at the top. Now, I don't want to focus on the first Mishnah here. Like I said, really, I feel like these Mishnayot are so rich that you could spend an enormous amount of time on each of them. So we have to be very disciplined not to do that, not to get this sidetracked. What I want to do in the course, again, it's in the synopsis, is I would like to show some of the textual elements with which the Mishnah deals, around which the Mishnah is built. And you'll see what I mean. okay? But you can't even start Masechet Avot and have a sense of what we're doing without at least taking a quick look at the first Mishnah, which again I know is very familiar to many people. So we'll start at the beginning here. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, umsara liYoshua, v'Yoshua lizkenim, uzkenim linviim, unviim misarua le'anshei knesset hagdola. Okay, that's the first part. Well, I'll identify that that's a separate part. We'll read the whole mission together. Now the second part, Heim amru shlosha dvarim, havu mitunim badin, v'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, va'asu siag laTorah. Okay, let's translate. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, and he delivered it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets. And the prophets delivered it to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, and raise many students, and build a fence for the Torah. Good. Okay, again, to do the 90-second treatment of this Mishnah, what is the Mishnah about? If you could, because we have three things that we learn from the members of the Great Assembly, but what is the theme? And I'll also say, against the backdrop, kind of keep in mind, this is the first Mishnah in the Masechet, and it's supposed to set some kind of a tone. Okay, so this is a bit of a trap question, but let me hear what you think.
Where the shalshelet, how it came to where we are, and how to preserve it in the future.
Oh, wow. Okay, excellent. Two things, two different parts, but nicely woven together. Okay, so your answer consists of two parts. Yeah. Yeah. How it relates to the future, you said.
So the first part is where it came from, how we got to today, and the second part is going forward. What's the basic way to save it?
Beautiful. Okay, how to save it and how to convey it to the future. Excellent. So again, as I said, we have two parts here, and really it could have been two separate Mishnayot. I really have to reel myself in not to spend too long on this particular Mishnah. But we're talking about the background, where everything came from. And then, as Debbie said, how to convey that, or how it's supposed to be thrown to the future. I would point out, thrown is not the right word, but we'll excuse me for that. Just now, I will point out that there are a couple words that are prominent in this Mishnah. I say prominent in terms of their placement, but also in terms of their frequency. And one which I think we don't necessarily always pay attention to, because the Mishnah has two parts, and we normally tend to describe these two parts as disparate. There's the word Torah. Really, I'm not going to call this Masechet Moshe, and I probably wouldn't call it Masechet Kibel either. It's not about Kibel, though we'll see how it is. But this is a Masechet about Torah, as Debbie said. It's the Shalshelet, the chain of transmission, how the Torah came all the way from the first person who received the Torah, from Moshe, down to something that we can touch, and that's all of the Mishnah. So it's about the Torah in that sense, where the Torah comes from, but also at the end, the Chachamim say, the Anshei Knesset Hagdola tell us, Asu siag laTorah. And in a certain sense, Asu siag laTorah is not just one of three teachings. It's kind of like encapsulating, and really Debbie already indicated this, it's encapsulating how we protect the Torah going forward. All of these things are about protect. So the whole Mishnah is about the Torah. And this is the first Mishnah in the Masechet. Now you could say chronologically, it's the first because, it has to start with the chronology. The clock has to start at 1 and then tick forward. But really it's also presented this way to tell us this whole Masechet is in some way about the motion of tradition, the progress of tradition. Maybe progress is also not exactly the right word, but the progression of the tradition. I want to point out two other words which I think normally completely ignore, but I think are so pivotal in understanding this Mishnah, and that is the two major verbs in the first part. kibel and masar, which are opposite and complementary verbs. The major action of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe has two actions. He receives and then he transmits. But I think very, very significantly, through the next several stages here, we don't have the word kibel repeated at all. Moshe was mikabel, Moshe received, but from Moshe moving forward, each stage was engaged in a process referred to as limsor, moser, delivering. If you take a step back, whose responsibility is this whole transmission of the tradition? Is it the teacher's responsibility, or it's the student's responsibility? And I believe that the Mishnah is very carefully telling us something about that also. So the Mishnah does not start by saying Hashem masar et haTorah leMoshe. I'm sure that 99.5% of everything you've ever read about Masechet Avot would change not at all if the Mishnah had started that way. Hashem masar et haTorah leMoshe. And then it would be consistent. Masar, 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 masar. But I think that the Mishnah is highlighting that first, there had to be someone to go and receive it. And Moshe, because he's the first one, has no choice but to be both the receiver and the transmitter, because he has no choice in that role of being in the pole position. But then, after a certain point, when we get to the men of the Great Assembly, the members of the Great Assembly, they say, wait a second, if this is really going to succeed, we need people to receive. We can't just always be transmitting. It can't just be that everything sits on the shoulders of the teachers, and then they'll just dump it in front of the students. The students have to actively receive something. And if I'm not mistaken, that's why they emphasize ha'amidu talmidim harbe. Raise many students. That's not a normal verb when you talk about a classroom. You don't talk about raising, you talk about teaching, instructing, enlightening, inspiring maybe. The word raise is really, it is an unusual verb to put here, but they use that verb because they're emphasizing that the students have to be stood up. They have to be raised as students. And if you think that I'm just being a preachy rabbi, maybe I am, but I hope I'm not being just a preachy rabbi. I'm going to prove it to you. If you look, Kayla, I'm sorry to make you crazy, but if you can go all the way to the bottom of the document, the last page of the document, or if someone has the text of Masechet Avot in front of them, thank you. Pages 5 and 6, mostly page 5. Yeah, mostly page 5 is great. Right there. If you have your own text, you can look at it yourself. In the first chapter, look at each successive generation over here in the Masechet. Shimon Tzadik, Antigonos Ish Socho, in Mishnah Gimel, Antigonos Ish Socho Kibel, Mishimon Tzadik. All of a sudden that word reappears. The word from Moshe Rabbeinu reappears. In the next generation, Mishnah Dalid, Yossi ben Yoezer, Yossi ben Yochanan, Kibelu Mehem. Mishnah Vav, Yehoshua ben Prachia, ben Yitzai Ha'arbeli, Kibelu Mehem, and so forth. This is a deliberate shift, which the Mishnah points to because of the program of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. We have to raise students who will be active as students, who will do the action of receiving. Okay, let's go back, please, to the top of the document. Are there any questions thus far? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no.
Are there other instances where they use laha'amid talmidim?
I'm not aware of another context. I'm not aware of another context. But it's worth a little check. I'll see if I can find something. Okay. So again, and now we are at 4:35, which looks good to, or 9:35, which looks good to me. Let's. I want to make it a point as much as possible in the time that we have together to highlight some things which probably are less well trodden. So some of the Mishnayot and Masechet Avot are really very famous, and I'll also say there are many statements from the rabbis which are very famous as being from Masechet Avot, even though they're not. Right? That's part of the nature of Masechet Avot. It's so quotable, you just assume, oh yeah, it's a brilliant thing that the rabbi said. That also must come from Pirkei Avot. Right? So sometimes we misattribute things to Pirkei Avot, but the things that actually do belong, some of them are quite famous. So let's. I would really like to focus on the second teaching of Hillel, which is Mishnah 113. But in order to do that, let's quickly read through all three of the Mishnayot from Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the Elder, which show up in the first chapter. I say the first chapter because Hillel and Rabbi Akiva end up being, they're not contemporaries at all. Hillel and Rabbi Akiva, but they are two celebrated figures from the Tannaitic period. Hillel is actually pre-Tannaitic, but those figures are the big stars, if you say anybody is. Those two are the big stars of Masechet Avot. They have more microphone time than everybody else. Hillel has 3 Mishnayot in the first chapter, and another 3 in the second chapter. Excuse me, but let's quickly read through the first 3 so we get a little bit of a sense of what he's doing and who he is in general. Okay, and again, we'll do this very quickly. Hillel the Shammai kiblu mehem. Again, skipping several generations. We get to the generation of Hillel and Shammai, and they received from Shemaiah and Avtalion. This is again Mishnah Yud Bet. Hillel Omer, Havei mitalmidav shel Aharon, Ohev Shalom ve'odev Shalom, Ohev et habriot umekorvan laTorah. So Hillel says, be among the students of Aaron. We're talking about Aaron HaKohen, Aaron the priest, the brother of Moshe Rabbeinu, and his. What does that mean to be a student of Aaron? Love peace and chase peace. Love people and bring them close to the Torah. You might notice a little yellow smudge on the paper here. That I did on purpose. Yellow highlight, because really it's a little bit ambiguous. If this semicolon belongs here or not. And I also have among my other loves is English literature, a little bit. It's, it's in its own place in line, back in the line, but I do love it too. Some of it anyway. Anyway, this semicolon is a great little tease, right? A great English teacher's exercise for the students is punctuate a blank paragraph, right? So I'm not sure if Hillel is giving us 2 or 3 teachings of Aharon or attributes of Aharon that we need to mimic. In other words, Ohev Shalom ve'odev Shalom, I believe, goes together. This is about Shalom, pursue peace. But then, is loving people its own thing, or loving people is expressed specifically in bringing them close to the Torah? I'll leave that to your own mind to figure out if you'd like that semicolon there. It's a distinct teaching, or that's really together. Let's move on to the next Mishnah. You know what? We'll skip that for now because I want to focus on that one, even though that's the next one in order. But just so you get a little sense of Hillel and how he speaks. Hu haya omer, and this was, I'm going to spare you the song, but the text of this Mishnah was a song that we sang at my 8th grade graduation. So there's musical notes to this one. Hu haya omer, he would say, Im ein ani li, mi li. Uchshe'ani le'atzmi, ma'ani. V'im lo achshav, imatai. This is very, very famous, but you hear, I'll translate. If I am not for me, who is for me? And if I am for myself, and here I change from me to myself because the Hebrew also changes. It's the difference between li and le'atzmi, but we don't have time to do too much about that right now. If I am for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? So you'll notice that there is automatically, right, inherent in this formulation, there is a little bit of music. There's a certain rhyme, rhythm to his teachings, and they bounce together. Li, la'atzmi, ma'ani. A matai is not e, but it still, I think, the same kind of stretching of the mouth a little bit. I should also point out, I'd leave it as a kind of an open question. Some of the Mishnayot and Avot have the formulation Omer, he says, and others have Haya Omer. And there may be some room there to distinguish between something which is a direct quote and something which is our paraphrase. Haya Omer, or also, as some of the authorities, some of the commentaries point out, Haya Omer may be a formula to indicate kind of thing that he just repeated all the time. It was, Chachamim said, Margala b'fumei. It was a gem in his mouth, and a kind of a slogan that he repeated time and again. So it makes sense that you see this, that Hillel came up with a little phrase, a catchphrase that he was able to spin together, and we're using his original words. Now let's go back to the more difficult, the most difficult of these three Mishnayot, a little bit less accessible, and that is because of its language. But we'll see that it fits Hillel very well. And that's Mishnah Yud Gimel. Hu haya omer, Nagid Shema, Avad Shemei. Udala Mosif, Yasef. Udala Yalef, Ktala Chayav. Ude Ishtamesh Bitaga, Cholaf, or Chalef, depending on particular nikudot. Okay. So he would say, this is again Hillel, he who stretches his name is lost. And he who does not add, he wastes away. And he who does not study, he is liable for execution. That's pretty harsh. And he who makes use of the crown, he passes. Okay, now the first thing that should jump out at us is that we needed to translate it. We really needed to translate, even those of us who are literate in Hebrew. Why do we need to translate this Mishnah? What makes it harder?
Aramaic.
It's Aramaic. It's not Hebrew at all. This should be striking, really. Why is this Mishnah written in Aramaic? I'll point out, and again, this appears in Rashbatz makes some notation of the fact that Aramaic is not a purely foreign language in the Jewish tradition. We even have segments of Tanakh, of the written Torah, the 24 books of the written tradition, which are written in Aramaic, large segments of Ezra and Nehemiah. And also, there is even a little bit of Aramaic, even the Chumash and the Torah and Sefer Breshit. So Aramaic already has and it's close. Many words are almost identical, but it is certainly close. It's a Semitic language, close to Hebrew. But Aramaic is almost like a junior holy language. That being said, the Mishnah is not written in Aramaic. And the Mishnah was written in Eretz Yisrael, and at a time when in Eretz Yisrael they spoke Hebrew. The Gemara is mostly written in Aramaic. So you're dealing with a language which really, on the one hand, it's not completely out of place. There are occasionally even Greek words and that make their way into the Mishnah, but that's a completely different topic. But in terms of a whole Mishnah being written in any language other than Hebrew, even Aramaic, that's certainly rare. That's not what we would expect. So why all of a sudden is this Mishnah written in Aramaic? Kayla, can I ask you to scroll down, please?
Is this better?
Why don't you go all the way to where the Bet Vav is the top of the page?
All right.
Thank you. So before we answer that question of why this is in Aramaic, I'll point out, I said before that Hillel has two sections in Avot. The first is in the first chapter, and the second is in the second chapter. And in the second chapter, we have this from Hillel. Afu ra'a gulgolet achat shetzafa al pnei hamayim. He also, one time, saw a skull which was floating on the surface of the water. A wonderful thing to think about at 9:45 in the morning. Little horror story for to start your day. He saw a skull floating in the water. Amar la, he said to it, Al de'ateft atfuch, v'sof mitifayich yutufun. Once again, Hillel is speaking Aramaic, and he says, since you drowned others, they drowned you. Someone drowned you. And in the end, those who drowned you will be drowned. Okay? This is a simple lesson of midah keneged midah, that the world's justice is administered among other things, but among other considerations. Hashem governs the world through the justice of what comes around goes around, but more specifically, you get what you give. And that's what Hillel said to this skull. There's again really a lot to talk about in terms of this specific case, this specific Mishnah, but unfortunately we'll have to leave that for another opportunity. What I will say is here we are actually hearing Hillel's address to the skull, and he addresses it in Aramaic. But it has a certain kind of a cadence, a rhythm to it, which again, I don't know that those are the first words that popped out of his mouth. But when Hillel's later describing it, he describes it in this term. And so I would point out just right away, again, also in light of the third Mishnah that we saw from Hillel, Yimena Nili Mili. So there's a lot of music. There's a lot of music, and the Mishnah is written in a way that is supposed to flow from our mouths and really to be easy to memorize. That's a much longer topic. The Mishnah in general has many formulations which are easy for us to memorize with wordplay. But in the 13 minutes that we have remaining, I would like to zero in more on this Mishnah, which we said the content of the Mishnah. Can we just go up a little bit again, please?
Which Mishnah?
To Aleph Yud Gimel, please.
All right.
Next time, I'll try to remember to have the sources numbered a little bit better. So again, these are the teachings. He who stretches his name is lost. And he who does not add, he wastes away. He who does not study is liable for execution. And he who makes use of the crown passes. Okay, thank you, Kayla. Now just go back down again, if you don't mind, to the first Avot to Rabbi Natan.
Absolutely.
Right there. Thank you. Okay. Again, there is a certain rhythm, I think, to the words in Aramaic. There's a lot of sounds that repeat themselves, and they can be bundled together in that way. However, there is also a significant thematic connection between all of these. It's very grim. Hillel is not really a grim person, so I'm sorry if we're casting him in a light which is not purely reflective. What are you going to do if you only have an hour? But all of these things kind of describe loss or being gone. It's grim, it's somber, it's very somber. First, to answer the question, which I hope that we'll still walk away even with this question, but we'll get the beginning of an answer to the question, why is this written in Aramaic? So very simply, the biography of Hillel begins in Bavel. Hillel comes in his origin, he comes from humble origins. Actually, ultimately, he's traced even back to the Davidic line, to the line of kings. But he's raised kind of off of the grid a little bit. Like I said, the locus of Jewish leadership at this time, and Hillel and Shammai lived more or less around the beginning of the Common Era. I say more or less. There's a couple holes that we need to fill in a little bit, but that's roughly the time. We'll see we may see next time that Hillel and Shammai were described as the teachers of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and we know Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the primary leading figure at the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the year 70, the second Beit HaMikdash, So Hillel and Shammai, if they're his teachers, they're more or less growing up and being in a leadership role in the early years of the beginning of the Common Era. Okay, and Hillel, and at that time, Jewish leadership, the Jewish community, scholarship for sure was centered in Eretz Yisrael, but there were Jews already in Babylonia. There's a large community there, and Hillel came from there, so he spoke Babylonian. And then when the Mishnah wants to quote him, we're quoting from his mother tongue. Okay, and that's what we have here in Avot Rabbi Natan. Afu omer bilshon bavli arba'a dvarim. And here we'll see that it's actually a little bit different than the teachings that we had in our own Mishnah. Ligid shema avad shmei, that one is the same. Udala mishamesh hakimaya ketala chayav. And this is already a little bit different. He who does not serve the sages, he is liable for execution. We didn't see anything about serving the sages in the Mishnah. Udala mosef pseid, he who does not add, he squanders. Udi ishtamesh betaga, in the Mishnah we had chalaf, and here in the Braita and Avot Rabbi Natan we have avad ve'azel lei. He who stretches, he who makes use of the crown, he is lost and goes away. Okay, let's before we go any further, let's explain a little bit more. What are these things that these crimes that the person, or I should say the four people being identified, what are these crimes consisting of, and what's so bad about them? Okay, so in order to answer this question also, you have to remember, let's table the question for just a moment. A question, a guiding thought, I think, that should accompany us throughout our study of the Mishnah, and we'll start with Masechet Avot. It could really be in the Mishnah in general, but in particular Masechet Avot, is who is the speaker and what exactly is he saying? It sounds really simple, right? Who's the speaker and what is he saying? But in Masechet Avot, and we'll see this really next week, particularly sharply, we have layers before even this Mishnah reaches us. We have layers. We have the original speaker, and he's telling us something, but then we have the editor of the Mishnah and the way that the editor presents it to us. And this relates also to this distinction that I mentioned before between hu omer, perhaps, and hu haya omer. But even in the hu haya omer, if I thought about maybe starting our session with this, what is your legacy? What do you say? And if I ask you, what you stand for, or what the lesson that you've taught your children, the lessons that you've taught your children, or the impression that you leave on people, you'll probably tell me something, and if you've been successful, then if I ask someone else, what did that person teach you, or what's that person's legacy, what do they stand for, they'll say something similar, but I highly doubt that they'll say it exactly the same way. They'll say it with the same emphasis, or they'll even use the same language. I'll say more than that. If there are 4 or 5 lessons, what would you put in order? What is the way that you would present them? And that's, some of us maybe will have that exercise. If you write an ethical will, you can put down in paper what it is. But I'm sure that there are people who've read ethical wills and of people that they knew and said, that's really what they stood for. That's what they taught us. I'm not sure about that. But here, I'm not saying that we're misrepresenting Hillel, but I would say Hillel is not actually purely representing himself. So somehow these statements got put together. I say Hillel, but really it's all of the speakers in the Mishnah. We really need to ask ourselves what this is. That concept put out, and I see it's 4:55, so we'll do a quick way to close ourselves to finish our topic. That said, there is a bit of an ethical will that Hillel is delivering, and as I pointed out, in particular here because it's Babylonian and that's Hillel's language, this is his formulation. So all of these statements, why do they get put together in his formulation? Why does he put these together? And what they all have in common is that they all talk about a certain responsibility that a person has, and failing to meet that responsibility, a person is lost, a person loses. We'll take another step. Who is the primary audience of Masechet Avot? So here the Rambam, Maimonides, in his introduction to all of the Mishnah, says that Masechet Avot speaks to two people. It speaks to the leaders and it speaks to the populace. And it speaks to the leaders more than anybody else, because as much as ethics, can't remember if Debbie said this at the beginning, ethics of the fathers, right? But that's one of the titles of Masechet Avot, ethics of the fathers. The word Avot definitely doesn't mean ethics, but all of the teachings are self-help kinds of things, good, quick hits of how a person can be their best person. So Rambam says these are important for everybody, but they're particularly important for the leadership. The leaders have to have an even greater responsibility of ethics. If we go back to the first Mishnah that we did here, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, we don't have to flip through the page, but just remember, right? I argued that the Mishnah's primary focus is the Torah. And Debbie said this also. The Mishnah is presenting to us how the Torah came to the rabbis and how it was supposed to be conveyed forward to the future. So if Hillel is addressing that audience, then all of this makes sense. You can't be about your own name and your own legacy. It's not if we remember you, Hillel. It's if your job was done, your job as a custodian of the Torah. That's also why we finish with this line, he who makes use of the crown. What's the crown? So many commentaries, and in fact, the Breita as well, Avot to Rabbi Natan, which we won't see inside right now, but it refers to invoking the ineffable divine name. God is called the omnipresent. That's his name that we don't say in Hebrew. We don't utter that in its Hebrew alliteration. The name means the omnipresent, the one who was and is and will be. And we'll finish literally in 60 seconds. So why are we talking? Who's using God's name? But that's the point. The addressees of the Mishnah are the custodians of the Torah. And they might be tempted to use these great tools that they have at their disposal, even God's name. Well, if you're using God's name, the Mishnah said, that person will be lost. Okay, we'll stop here. And I'm happy to pick up, God willing, next week. Is there any quick questions? I'm here.
I remember learning that it was also addressed to the judges. That's why it's placed where it is in the Mishnah.
That's the second part of what the Rambam says. In other words, that's for sure. He says the leader. Why does he get to the leaders? Because Avot is right next to, is very close to Masechet Sanhedrin. Exactly.
Just wanted to, say thank you, Rabbi Kohn, for teaching, and thank you everyone for coming and joining us on what is an early-ish morning in the U.S. and an afternoon in Israel. And this class is recording will be up on Zoom momentarily if you missed any bits of it or came in a little late. And if you like this, there are many more Sfira Zman offerings at drisha.org/classes. Rabbi Kohn, everyone in this class, I hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good. So I couldn't bring it up.